All right, welcome to Witchpolice Radio. For regular listeners of the show, you know that this podcast usually interviews Manitoba and Manitoba adjacent, I like to say it, musicians and people who are connected in some way to the local music scene. And the guest I have on this episode is someone who has been on the show before, but this was in the really early days. I think you were on in maybe 2014 or maybe even 2013. And it was at that point we were still trying to
2013,
figure
yeah.
out. Yeah, it's been almost a decade, and the show has progressed and changed, and a lot of different things have happened over that time. So this is probably not very recognizable as the same show you were on back then. But you've obviously done a lot since then. Not necessarily music related, although we will talk about some music connected stuff that you're working on. But I mean, you can probably introduce yourself better than I can. But you're an artist, a podcaster. You got fingers in a lot of different. Is pies the right term? It doesn't sound right, but I think it is. Fingers in a lot of different pies, and I think the best way to start this off is if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Okay. Well, I am GMB Chomichuk. I don't have cool band names like most of your guests, but the E stands for Gregory, and I'm a writer, illustrator who sometimes I write for other illustrators, sometimes I illustrate for other writers. Sometimes I write and illustrate my own work. I write novels. I've done some work in theater and video games and television, but primarily my everyday job is making comics and graphic novels.
And you've been doing that for quite a while, because I mean, even back when you were on the show, again, almost 10 years ago, you were well into that career of making comics and graphic novels, even then.
Yeah, 10 years ago. Okay, first off, I think it bears saying, although I'm sure some of your regulars have also said it. 10 years you've been basically running a pirate radio station, and it's, you're like OG. It's so wild, right?
It is
To have
crazy.
stuck with it. We've done one for 3 4 years now, and every time that rolls over in my head, I honestly think of the first time I went with my friend Michael Zastry, who was Iron Buddha on the show, who was doing experimental music, and you had this experimental thing, which, in those days we were like, a podcast, what's that going to be about? How is that going to work? And to be reconnecting again all these years later, still both of us doing our thing, undeterred by the events of a weird world. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, it's nice to see. It's nice to see people are still creating weird stuff, whatever medium they're doing something, creating their weird stuff with, and you keep on going. I mean, I think there's almost an addiction to it, whether it's whatever it is. If you find something creative, an outlet that works for you, I think you get kind of sucked in, and you can't. I can't stop at this point. I can't see myself stopping this show anytime in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, someone asked me, they're like, "Oh, you're making comics full time, man." And I was like, "Yeah, it's more of a compulsion. It's as much of a compulsion as it is a profession at this point."
I can believe it for sure, for sure. So, I mean, maybe before we get into any sort of the newer stuff you've been doing, what would people recognize you from? Because, like, again, you've been working at this for a long time. This compulsion of yours has got you a lot of attention. I mean, you've your name's been out there. You've done some high profile work that people might recognize. What's sort of the best way to delve into the amount of work you've done and your bibliography, I guess.
Well, two, I think, music adjacent ones, which your listeners may know the bands if I drop their names. Isque, singer-songwriter Isque, David Alexander Robertson, and I all worked on a graphic novel together called Will I See, which was based on one of Isque's songs, which then David adapted into a graphic novel. Then Highwater Press did a blind submissions, basically saying, we're looking for artists to work on this book, and we're taking blind submissions. And I submitted my work to that. I knew Dave already, but there was a blind submission process, and so he was like, it won't be up to me. And then turned out we got to work together, and it was a life-changing experience based on, that book is. I tend to work. I'll just say this for your dear listeners. My work tends to be like weird monster stuff that is a Venn diagram of 30s pulps, 40s propaganda, and 60s style guides. But Will I See is a book about a real lived experience. It's about missing and murdered Indigenous women and children, and it was a book where I got to work on a story where the monsters, unfortunately, are real. And so that was a real for me I'd spent 10 years as an educator also. And so it was a nice way of putting all those different tools in my toolbox together to work on a project like that. And then later I worked with the Japanese heavy metal band Baby Metal to produce their graphic novel for Z2 Comics. And that was a singular experience where at one point the band arranged for me, where were we, in Nashville, to be on stage with them so that I could draw some reference and do some stuff while they were performing.
Cool.
And Kobo Metal noticed that I was a little bit, maybe that this wasn't the spot I wanted to be. And I explained that I really appreciated the sort of VIP treatment, but I kind of need to feel what the crowd is feeling. Is there a way that I could sort of join the crowd and observe that? And then they moved my seat to on top of the sound booth. So now I had this spot on top of the sound booth. So I was right in the middle of the crowd, seeing the band and absorbing that whole energy to try and turn, into a graphic novel. And at a certain point, I had to pinch myself and say, you never know where comics are going to take you.
Yeah, that's a cool experience. And I think that kind of there's definitely a connection between like underground DIY art of all different kinds, whether it's visual, whether it's written, whether it's musical. There's definitely like a kinship, and I feel like comics and music do have a strong connection. There's been so many, even just album covers and things like that, and liner notes and comics about musicians, and there's been so much crossover over the years between the two genres that it makes sense that you can mesh them together and come up with something interesting.
Well, in comics, like, I'm not. I like to be music adjacent. My wife is very musical, and my neighbor is Joey Semp, so we have musicians over all the time around the neighborhood. And making comics is so much like making music in that it's a group effort where a very small number of people are trying really hard to add their little piece to a shared vision. And it doesn't always work, but when it does work, everyone agrees. Like there's that moment of like, there it is. We're in the groove now. We're in the zone. This is what we're trying to achieve as a group thing. And so,
yeah, it's just a different set of tools, I guess, right? It's a different use of your brain, but it's the same idea for sure.
Yeah. So it's pretty cool. And I think, part of why I reached out to you. So for your dear listener, Sam posted that he was looking for musical guests or more people to reach out to for the podcast. And I realized that I had a curiosity. And what I really needed was someone who spends a lot of time talking directly with musicians, talking directly in that language. I did this project called Red Earth, where I embedded myself with a theater troupe, and we turned a graphic novel project into a theater show.
Oh, cool.
And one thing I learned is that everyone has different nouns and verbs and adjectives for how they do their creative expression. And once you learn that, you can kind of dig into that and collaborate a lot better. And I've been wanting to collaborate in a music space with some people on some projects, and I don't have the language. So my first thought was, maybe I should call you up and we should have this talk. And then I was like, well, we might as well record this talk.
Sure. Yeah. Why not? Right.
And you can drop the knowledge on me as I ask you some questions.
Well, what is it you're trying to do? I mean, just this is kind of an interesting way to go with the conversation, because usually I'm asking questions here to the guests. But I mean, what is it you're trying to do? What kind of collaboration are you looking to do with musicians?
Well, so I have this. So I'll give a little context. So Andrea Sardison, who I worked on Red Earth with, she introduced me to this notion of something called devised theater, which is essentially, and for any theater majors who are listening, pardon my poor summation of a very complicated idea, but it's essentially when you get a whole bunch of people of a certain set of skills together into a room, and then once they're all together, you devise the project in the room.
Okay.
Which fits into an ethos of mine, which is movement gives shape to form. And that's not mine. I stole that from Da Vinci. But sometimes if you want to get something done, you just get a bunch of people together who also want to get something done. And if they're good people, you can create a project out of it. So I have a number of graphic novel projects that I own outright. I've made a real effort in my career to keep creative control over a lot of different stuff, which means I have ancillary rights. I have the way to produce it into lots of different media. And I thought a fun way to go, since I had some pretty successful music related collaborations, was to find some bands locally, find some people locally who would like to add a visual element, an illustrative element, and a storytelling element to a project of theirs, and find a way to make it work.
That's really cool. And I think there are probably a lot of bands that have interesting visual parts of what they do anyway that would probably relate to that well, in the sense that like they have not everyone, but certain bands definitely have like an image that accompanies the sound, right? And they definitely have some kind of visual identity. And I think that you could definitely find someone who is willing to make that into a larger piece or a larger project.
Yeah, or maybe to add to a project they already have with some visual elements. I'm not sure. My first question to you,
Sure, yeah, go for it.
fact finding, exchange of ideas, is how do I encapsulate that notion to a group of insulated creatives, let's call them. A band is its own unit, right? How do you come from the outside to a group of people who have their own sound figured out, who have their own idea, they know what they're trying to do, and not sound like a complete crazy person saying to them like, okay, what your band needs is an illustrator, right? Not a drummer, not someone to work the soundboard, right? But an illustration component or a storytelling element, right?
Well, I think you almost want to approach it the same way as music video directors approach bands, because a lot of the time you see a music video and it could be a completely different concept than what the song was actually about, but the band has collaborated with that person and they've sort of come up with they've listened to the song probably repeatedly on end and figured out what it evokes to them and then presented that visually. So I don't think it's that different from that idea of just I think your first step would have to be to find the song or the album or the artist that you want to do this with, and kind of familiarize yourself enough with the music that it speaks to you and you can explain what it's saying to you, and then you can tell the band that. Because I mean, like even doing these
I don't
podcasts,
come across as a sycophant or a person that is just like a stage 5 clinger. Like can't really slide into their DMs and be like, I've got a great idea for you.
that might be a problem. But you could also just, I mean, if you present it as you are who you are, you're a well-known artist. You've done all these graphic novels, you've done these music-related books, you have all this experience, and you're looking to collaborate. And if you have certain bands that you already know that you like and that something about it you connect with, I think it's a little different than some random person saying, "Let me draw you" or whatever, right? Because you have an existing you have an existing career as an artist, and people know you, and people can check out your work and see if it's something that they feel would jibe with what they're doing.
So if I were to send care packages to bands around the city, and one of the reasons why I want to do it local is because we have a studio space, we have a lot of room, we could do a jam space there. There's a way for people to put their heads together in a city that then I don't have to travel. I travel enough, and I want to find a way to have a fun, investigative collaboration without also spending weeks away from my family, which I already do too much.
Well, one of the things you described earlier almost sounded like a jam. I mean, the idea of that collaboration and everyone coming together and bringing their own skills and everything, and then it developing into something. Like, I would almost suggest that you just listen to someone's music and create what you want to create, even a draft version of what it is, and then just show it to them and say, "Look, this song I was listening to, this is what has come out of my brain in connection with this song. Are you interested in developing this into something further?" And then maybe that's a better way of approaching it than just going at them cold and saying, "Hey, can you make something with me?" If you've already shown that like this is your vision with their work, I don't know. It's an interesting idea.
Like a cold call where I produce some work for them.
Yeah, I mean that could backfire and they could hate it, but
Yeah, I think what it stems from is that both of the musical projects that I mentioned earlier, they were already underway before I came on.
Right.
And so there are plenty of ways where I would have made different choices or had suggestions for the form, content, delivery, where that's not, it just wasn't my place at that moment to do those kinds of things. And so you just hold your peace when you're in that, let's call it that stratosphere of publishing.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
You've been
Sure.
asked or invited into a project. You don't then say, "Oh, I have a better idea," right? That's not the role you try to play. But sometimes, when I found with Red Earth and with the devised theater, where the beginning portion was, let's everyone share what they really want to bring forward, and then let's find a constellation that we can see in all those stars, and then make that the thing we're doing. And the entire time I was working with these, talented playwrights and actors, and, just in the back of my mind, I was like, if only we had 5 or 6 musicians here. Right. That was my first thought. And so it literally was rekindled when you made that post that said, "Oh yeah, I'm looking for more musicians to come talk on the show about the local scene." I was like, I need musicians in my life. Maybe I should talk.
Well, and maybe someone will hear this and then reach out to you. That could be a benefit of doing this. But
well, okay, let's play that game. Let's play that game.
Sure.
Let's play that game. Okay, Sam. So if you're a person listening to this or watching us have this conversation, depending on what medium you're consuming this.
Yeah.
And so I have a project called Moon Patrol, which is haunted robots on the moon, keeping monsters on the dark side of the moon. That's actually a retelling of Sigurd and the Dragon. And it's a 400-page illustrated graphic novel where there are no words at all. So it's the kind of project where bringing music to it and rearranging all of the images that already exist into some other format. Simple, I think, if it's the right fit. So that would be something that if someone's listening is like, "Hey, I got an idea for that." There's one. I have another project called the Minus Institute, which is set in an alternate history, 1950s, where all the money that was spent on atomic research was spent on psychic research instead. And that one, I think the person would have to know how to play a theremin to make that one really, really sing. And
there's a few theremin players out there. Winnipeg has not very many of them, but there are some. Yeah.
I was actually having a conversation about one just today. That's why it's on my mind. And then I have 2 complete prose projects, Automatic Age, which is basically like a robot post-apocalypse story, a father and son trying to survive in the future we were promised in the covers of old Popular Mechanics. But they can't touch anything in the world, or the robots will know they're there. And so they just basically live in a desert where every delight is available, but they can't possibly interact with it, or the robots will sense that there's a human there and come and kill them.
Right.
So like this is the kind of themes and stuff that interests me, and kind of stuff that I think one of the reasons why I think I ended up doing art for a heavy metal band had a lot to do with those constituent parts.
Yeah, well, and thematically, that kind of stuff definitely suggests a lot of metal bands. I mean, or prog rock bands and things like that, because there's that kind of sci-fi fantasy element to it that a lot of those bands like employ. But do you have an idea of what type of music you would like to see with these? Like when you're drawing these, when you have putting this work together, is there some kind of soundtrack that you have in your head and you're trying to find that, or are you hoping someone can come up with their own version of what that should?
I guess both. Like each piece, each of those things I named, I could see a completely different kind of architecture that could be built around it musically. The other piece that I see to it is, as the way that people consume music changes, and love it or hate it, if you're on Spotify, there's a part of Spotify that is now visual, where they're showing you images along with the lyrics and along with music. And all I can think of when I see that is like, nobody knows any illustrators. Why aren't these parts? Why is it the same image frozen here while the lyrics roll? You have a beautiful opportunity to have art add to the story while people are listening to the music. And so it's just something a nascent curiosity. And what I've found in my artistic life is that the only way to find people who are willing to do those kinds of experiments, how I ended up doing Red Earth, how I ended up doing Passing Tonk and Dragon Nanny, or the Imagination Manifesto, was just telling people, I have this weird idea for a project, and do you want to do it? Let's figure out how to get it done.
Yeah. That's the best way to do anything.
That's right. So this is like coming onto the pirate radio. And what made me really want to come on this show is that we were in your basement. Well, I wasn't involved in making the music at all, just Iron Buddha, Michael Zastry. He just knew that I had always been supportive of his exploration of this style of experimental music he was doing. So he was like, hey, I'm going to go on Witchpolice. You want to come with me?
Yeah.
And it was more like, I was like the support animal, and while we were there doing that, I was like, man, people can do anything. Why don't we just do more stuff like this?
Well, and that's the best. That's why I do the podcast, I think, and I think that's probably why you do a lot of what you do as well. Is just the idea that, like, why aren't people doing this? If you have a crazy idea or something that seems like it's like this idea you have, it hasn't happened yet, so just make it happen, right?
I also have to. I don't know if this qualifies as a confession or not, but it feels like a confession. So I'm gonna put it that way. Sam, I have a confession to make. I stole an idea from you,
okay,
and I turned it into something else. At least that's how it felt, because I never talked to you about it. And it goes like this. It's like literally behind your head. Witchpolice, the title, ever since 10 years ago, it has haunted me because it's the perfect title for a graphic novel. And I don't know where the idea of Witchpolice came from, but for me, it was like, were they police that hunt witches? Were they witches that were police? Is there a magical police squad somewhere? Are there hard-boiled detectives smoking cigarettes and casting hexes and solving murders? And I went down a whole train, which eventually, as I was like sort of like playing with this idea that I couldn't shake out of my head, I made a mini story that was literally about hard-boiled witch police, like police.
Oh, awesome.
And I couldn't quite make it work, but then I got obsessed with noir fairy tale stuff, and all of that turned into, I probably have it here, all of that turned into this book called Fairy Tale Ending. So there is like this thread from the idea that you had to call your podcast and your like exploration of people's like interests, Witchpolice. Really, I not to put too fine a point on it, but I honestly don't know if this book would have existed if that first like grit hadn't got in the oyster, right? I don't know what it was, but so
that's hilarious. I have to read that now.
Yeah. Well, and what this is actually a book about how to make stories. It's not even a straight up graphic novel. I mean, it's hard to show on the screen here, but it's all these prompts for story making. So if someone wants to make their own fairy tale, their own grim, dark, noir fairy tale where you hunt down witches or you are a witch police, you can check out Fairy Tale Ending. But it's really just a way of like making up cool stuff for whoever wants to use it. It's not like a straight graphic novel. So,
but well, I'm glad the stupid name has influenced something, because I mean, the story is. I'm not going to tell the story here because it's really not that interesting about why we have the name.
You're not going to tell me why it's called this after I just bared my soul.
I'm stuck with it now, and I kind of like it. At first, I was the short version. There's a longer version which I can get into later, but the short version is that basically I was in a band with Rob Crooks. I'm not sure if you know Rob Crooks. He's a local rapper, producer, singer, songwriter, makes electronic music as well. And he we had a band called Dynamo. That was just this project we did where we played weird electronic music together whenever we had time.
Before or after Grandpa's Army?
This is much after. Yeah, this is like early 2000s, I guess. So we had a song called "We Are the Witchpolice," and the name Witchpolice was something I had written down based on a comment a friend had said while watching a horror movie. I thought it was funny. I wrote it down, put it in my pocket, and then years later, we needed to name this song that didn't have anything to do with witches or police, and came up with "We Are the Witchpolice." And then, so I guess I am explaining it. And then, so when we wanted to put the music online for people to hear, because we didn't play a lot of shows, we weren't going to release an album or anything. We had these 2 songs. I made one of those free blog sites in, like, 2000 and whatever, and you needed to give it a URL. So it was something.blogspot.com. So I just put Witchpolice, and that eventually turned into all of this music stuff that got posted on there, and eventually turned into a podcast, which I didn't know what it was when we started it. Neither did my co-hosts at the time, and we needed to call it something, and the site was called Witchpolice that we were hosting it on. So Witchpolice Radio. So it's connected to a song that has nothing to do with witches or police. That was a name taken from a comment that a friend made years before that while watching, I think it was Rosemary's Baby. And I think I said something about, no, why didn't you call the police? And then she said, who are they going to call? The Witch Police? It was something like that. And so it really doesn't mean anything, but it's stuck now. And I think it's weird enough that people remember it. So I'm happy with it now.
Well, and isn't that just, that's the crux of all creative exploration. It's just something you can't shake, and it just lives with you. Like I have, I've got stacks of sketchbooks here. What I do in my own creative practice is, when I'm switching from an old sketchbook to a new sketchbook, I go through the old one, I find the idea that I'm not done with. I don't know what it's for yet. And then I make the first couple of pages of my new sketchbook a copy of whatever was in the old one.
Okay.
I just sort of bring that idea forward, and it iterates. And sometimes it lives through 3 or 4 sketchbooks before it finally dies and just drifts to the ether. And sometimes, like Witchpolice, it haunts me for years as a thing I keep writing in. I probably have 10 years worth of sketchbooks where the word Witchpolice is written somewhere, where I'm trying to make it work as something. And it came out of me as a way into this project called Fairytale Endings. So, whoever that friend is, we owe them a debt.
Right, for giving us this name, this
Yes.
ridiculous name. Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot more we could get into, and I actually have some ideas of bands that might work with this thing. And I'm going to tell you off the air because I don't want to put them on the spot in case they're not interested. But
this guy's a freak. Get out of here.
Yeah, exactly, right. But before we wrap this up, though, what's the best way for someone to get in touch with you? If someone hears this and says, this is a great idea, this is perfect project for me to collaborate with, first of all, what's the best way to get in touch with you? And then secondly, what's the best way to find your work online? Because again, you've been doing this for a long time. You got a lot of books out. You got a lot of other projects. Is there like a central hub to check you out?
So it's interesting because, okay, there's a couple of questions. I'm going to ask you a question first, and then I'm going to answer that.
Sure.
How do people get in touch with you normally when they're listening to the show?
Social media, typically.
Just through social media? Do you have like a nice shield of just social media?
I'm on a bunch of them, and I post stuff constantly, so I'm pretty easy to find. Yeah,
pretty easy to find. So I would say this, for my sake, I would need a person to vet, someone who is a shall we call them a sommelier of the local music scene, to be able to say to me, hey, this person, they're interested in, oh, this is the kind of music they like, and oh yeah, they're totally like someone you should check out. So maybe if they're interested in like a weird graphic novelist being in the band, I don't know if that's really they should reach out to Witchpolice Radio first, and then we can work it out there. If someone's looking for me, they can look up GMB Chomichuk .ca, or they can Google any of the books I've worked on, like Moon Patrol or the Imagination Manifesto or Apocrypha or Will I See or Automatic Age. My name is both hard to pronounce, hard to spell, and sometimes hard to remember. So
it'll be in the show notes, though. We got show notes. The title of the episode will have your name in it. It'll be easy to find that way. So yeah, people can.
They can also look up Super Pulp Science, which is our podcast where we talk about how genre gets made and how we do everything they do. So if someone's like, interesting, but I'd like to know more about this guy, they can hear me talk about the creative process that we've done on all those projects I mentioned on Super Pulp Science, and then decide whether or not they would want me to darken the doorstep of their practice space or not.
Perfect.